We are going to move on to our next panel, and I think they are here. The moderator will be Mary. So Mary, I'm just gonna shush it and turn it over to you so you can do what you do and introduce your panelists.
Thanks so much, Charlie. Thanks for having me. And I'm really excited to introduce the panelists that we have on for today. I'm going to jump right into their backgrounds, and then we'll get into some questions. So first up, we have William Pagán. He's an award-winning patent attorney at Coates and Bennett, PLLC. His practice focuses on the intersection of law and computing technology with a focus on patents, trademarks, and copyright. He's also a member of the NC State University Computer Science Alumni Hall of Fame, an IBM Master Inventor who's named on more than 130 patent applications. He graduated summa cum laude and co-valedictorian from NCCU School of Law. Next up, we have Anup Suresh. Anup is a principal and registered patent attorney at Schwegman, Lundberg, and Woessner, and he currently serves as the firm's data security officer. Practice focuses on patent procurement and the development of business-focused patent strategies covering electrical, software, mechanical, and computer technologies. Before entering law, Anup worked as an embedded software engineer at the Boeing Company, where he helped develop and test avionics software for C-17 and C-130 aircraft. And last, but of course not least, is Adonne Washington. Adonne is a policy counsel at the Future of Privacy Forum in Washington, D.C., where she specifically focuses on privacy and technology related to data, mobility, and location. Prior to joining FPF, Adonne was the Digital Justice Associate Counsel with the National Branch of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, working on matters at the intersection of racial justice, technology, and privacy. And she's a graduate of Howard University School of Law. So welcome again to our panelists. Thank you for being here today. I've given sort of your general backgrounds, but I'd love to have you each start by introducing yourself and how the current issues we're talking about today, privacy, data security, and cybersecurity, affect your work. And let's go in alphabetical order. So we can start with Adonne, then do Anup and Will.
Hi, good morning. One thing left off my bio, I do also practice intellectual property in my free time, just not at the prestigious level of patents. I do trademarks and copyrights, and so happy to be here presenting to everyone. So as it relates to my work, it kind of, with the bio, comes in everything that I do. I think data privacy is really important to the practice of law. I think the last panel actually touched on it perfectly right at the end with some of their comments as it relates to understanding kind of the lingo and understanding where the trends are going, where things are, where the next level of technology and privacy and data are headed. In all of my work, I can delve into the number of different things that I have touched on. But to get into more of the questions, I will cede to my other panelists.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. Yeah, my name's Anup Suresh. So I'm actually a practicing patent attorney, but I also have the distinction of being our data security officer for our law firm, which deals with like handling our overall data security infrastructure and our policies, interfacing with clients and their requests and their needs. So from a day-to-day standpoint, most of my work is just the patent practice, but from week to week, we deal with a lot of client requests. So I'm sort of the primary interface for those interactions and the overall strategy for how the firm's going to deal with data security issues, insurance issues, and meeting our requirements, and for future planning of how we can keep up with the ever-changing landscape of technology that keeps coming out and how they're using the practice of law.
And yeah, my name is Will Pagán, and as part of my management responsibilities here as one of the co-owners of Coates and Bennett, I'm in charge of IT, and that means data security and tooling and software and all that stuff. So they stuck that with the computer science guy. In a sort of on a daily basis, we have clients that as a requirement for interacting with them, because we're handling their patents, which necessarily must remain secret before we file for protection, they require that we implement end-to-end encryption for all communication. And so yeah, I lead a team, or I manage a team of outside contractors to help us with our IT, but I'm sort of the first line of defense, and I deal with all of the sort of the strategic decision making with respect to how do we implement that in our systems and make sure that our clients' information is secure, and how do we implement storage in a way that ensures security and is resilient against attack and interlopers and so on. So data security is not just something that I understand or deal with in a technical sense for my clients, but also in a day-to-day sense and in a business sense with respect to the operations of my firm.
Thank you all. I appreciate that additional context. I was starting with sort of what Will was mentioning around data security. I wanted to start with you, Anup. You have a technical background. You mentioned your role as the data security officer at your firm. Could you define data security and cybersecurity for folks in the audience? How are they different? How are they similar? What would you find each one?
Yeah, I feel like there's overlap there. So cybersecurity is more the overarching, I guess if you want to call it, domain in which you have to deal with all security issues, data and otherwise, but also from internet standpoint, from data privacy standpoint, where I feel data security is more narrow as to space of controlling who has actual access to your data, preventing data breaches, and making sure that, if in the practice of law at least, that the information that you're collecting from clients or the ones that they entrust you with is only being accessed by those who are authorized. And that goes hand in hand with, at least in the practice of law, of keeping client confidentiality is actually probably pretty key with that. So in effect, you have to, from a data security standpoint, you have to keep up with the industry, keep up with the industry practice and standards, meet insurance standards, so that you have the proper data security in place. But then when we're looking at the broader sense of cybersecurity, we're looking at, well, what are our policies? What are the tools that our practitioners are using? How are we gaining access to information that the clients are providing us? And then just from a practice standpoint, is your team or your group of individuals that are working at the firm actually executing good practices and trained up in what they need and what they shouldn't be doing as they function in their day-to-day jobs?
And Will, I think this intersects with your work as well. You mentioned the importance of keeping client information secure and encryption as one tool to help that. Can you tell us a little bit about the technology that you use and the best practices that you see for protecting data and networks in your role?
Sure. I think a current best practice is something called end-to-end encryption. End-to-end encryption ensures that data is protected and secure from the moment of transmission until the moment it arrives at its intended recipient. And there are a number of tools that implement security and protect. They hide your data and so on, but they don't do it all the way from the moment they first transmit all the way to the endpoint, right? So, for example, if you use a cloud service, the cloud service might say something like, "Hey, your data is secure here on the cloud." But that's not a representation that when you send something to the cloud that it's secure, or that when something comes back from the cloud, it's secure in transit. So end-to-end security is fantastic. The problem with end-to-end security is it puts an additional burden on the end users, right? It'd be nice to be able to say, "Hey, I use a cloud provider, and that cloud provider just makes everything happy and protected, and I don't have to worry about it." But if you want protection all the way down to where you are in your home, Sometimes that means that you've got to install some software, support some software, make sure you keep your updates up to date on your home computers, that your home router, for example, is secure and will support it. So there are additional burdens that, unfortunately make this a little bit more cumbersome for end users who may not be tech savvy. So grandma at home might not know what it means to update her encryption certificate, for example, right? Like that kind of thing. So pluses and minuses for sure.
And Adonne, I want to bring you in here as well. So the technical measures and security protocols we've been talking about are related to privacy, which is your focus. But I think you would probably define privacy a little bit differently. Can you sort of tell us what is privacy from your perspective, and what are some examples of ways that it is or isn't protected under the current legal regime?
Sure. So broadly speaking, and honestly, when you probably ask most people, privacy is the right to be, left alone, or freedom from interference or intrusion from others around you, companies, entities, whomever you interact with, right? Information privacy is the right to have some control over how your personal information is collected, used, retained, who it's shared with, what it does, where it goes, what it's used for. With technical innovations, we kind of see these advancements, all of the AI, all of the different, the use of AI is kind of prolific, but that's a whole different conversation. And kind of technical innovations with all the tech that we interact with on a daily basis. Things are advancing. This could also mean things, social media platforms, they're always changing and updating. Your phones are always changing and updating. And as the technology gets more sophisticated, there's a level of invasiveness that also comes with that. So the uses of data also increase. The thing that you signed up to give your email to might now be used at a later date to send you an email for something else, right? And that leaves organizations facing an incredibly complex risk matrix for ensuring that personal information is protected. What this looks like for an organization, a company, entity, anyone who is doing any collection of data, and that could be just data generally, that you input. It could also be more sensitive and personal information. How do we handle and how do we rationalize what to do with that information, right? And now we see states trying to handle privacy and data security and protection at varying levels. This is my regular plug for a federal privacy federal privacy legislation. It would be great. One other thing I do want to say is data privacy is focused on the use and governance of that personal data. The difference here that I think both Anup and Will spoke to is that security focuses more on protecting the data from those malicious attacks and the exploitation of stolen data, potentially for profit in certain instances. While security is necessary for protecting data, it is not always sufficient for addressing privacy. And so, as I mentioned, state laws have started to kind of chip away at, not at companies and at institutions in their states for not protecting certain individuals' privacy and data. And so different states, we see biometric specific bills, we see artificial intelligence specific legislation. We see states like California, which is, I think, probably the most notable and the first to have a statewide data privacy kind of protection. I say first in the US, let's say that, because outside of the US, other countries have begun to kind of take this more seriously. So privacy touches kind of everything in every industry, every entity. It kind of varies in terms of what data is being collected, but we're trying to see at the state level and even some federal bills that have been proposed, how do we handle this issue of protecting individuals' data and individuals' privacy?
Thanks, Adonne. And I think you're sort of pointing out that there's not comprehensive consumer or federal legislation on privacy leads well into our next topic, which is, while there may not be comprehensive laws at the federal level in either the area of consumer data privacy or in substantive cybersecurity regulations, we are, I think, because of what you pointed out, the advances in technology and the growing data collection by companies, we are seeing a lot more interest in the federal government on these issues. We've had federal executive orders on AI and sensitive data, high-profile congressional hearings lately with social media CEOs, and inquiries out of both the FCC and the FTC on both privacy and data questions. I'd love to hear from each of you what types of activity at the federal government you're watching closely and focusing on in these areas, maybe starting with Anup.
Yeah, sure. And I know the panel that just preceded us touched on generative AI. But with the emergence of tools such as those, the interest or concern as to where data is collected, how data is inputted, where it's stored, how it's being used has sort of been renewed. And in a sense, because of the implications of Gen AI and how it's being used even in the practice of law, but let's put that aside, even from a business standpoint, there are ethical obligations of where that data is going and whether you're meeting the sort of what you kind of listed as, and Adonne had mentioned, where the regulations are coming out. And it's not just client data, it's also just the PII data, the personal information, identifiable information that you collect from some of these clients and may, inadvertently submit into some of these tools, and where that data is going. We have extra obligations when it comes to handling and managing that kind of information. So there's no clear rules with, at least for Gen AI, as to where everyone stands. And in the practice of law, at least the individual state bars are still kind of working through like guidelines and policies of how we should be and should not be using these tools. But I think key, at least for the practice of law, is client confidentiality, if that's being maintained. It's sort of the Wild West with the amount of tools that are coming out and what's available and what people are using. It almost comes down to having the proper policies in place and the proper training, at least for the people who you're working with, and ensuring that those policies at a very high level are meeting those ethical and the client obligations that you're subject to.
And we have a question in the chat, which I think maybe Will can answer a little bit in his discussion, since we were sort of moving into this question. We've talked a little bit about end-to-end encryption and what the benefits of it are. There's sort of a debate going on in the at the federal level between the federal government and tech companies on encryption and whether it has downsides. We also have a question in the chat about whether there is additional comments on the overall zero trust strategy apart from end-to-end encryption, data collection, and retention and policy. So Will, if you have thoughts on that as well.
So I think it should be highly concerning to everyone that we are seeing the federal government, and local governments, state governments as well, just government and law enforcement in general, pressuring tech companies to build in backdoors into security mechanisms so that they can gain access to data whenever they're able to obtain a warrant. And there are a couple of concerns that creates. One is, of course, there's an opportunity for governmental abuse. But there's also a concern where anytime you build in a backdoor, you're building in a weakness into an otherwise secure mechanism, right? So the way that government would like it to work is that, let's say Apple, who has an end-to-end encryption scheme that protects their messaging architecture, they want Apple to build a backdoor in. And if government produces a warrant, they give that warrant to Apple, and then Apple gives government the ability to access that backdoor. The problem is that, well, if that backdoor exists, then Apple can also access that backdoor. And by the way, now, once government has access, government can access that backdoor, probably, most likely in an uncontrolled way. And then, by the way, anyone who is in between the communication between Apple and the government, who is able to intercept that mechanism, is also able to access that backdoor. And and that backdoor sits on Apple servers. So anyone who intrudes on Apple servers is able to steal the mechanism to access that backdoor. This is not a system that currently has any of these vulnerabilities, but government wants us to build these weaknesses into an otherwise secure system. That's problematic. It's an opportunity for exploitation, abuse, opportunity for hackers hostile nation states, any number of bad actors to come in and use the back door in a way that is not intended. And of course, there's the constitutional concern of, look, you have a right to have to be secure in your papers, right, under the Fourth Amendment. And you would never give government the master key to your house. You know, you have naughty things that you want to keep private from the world in your house. That's your business until government knocks down your door. Well, because you can't knock down, it's mathematically impossible or nearly impossible to break some of the more modern encryption schemes. Government's just going to require data technology companies to create a master key just for them and keep that in a, and sort of leave that as a juicy golden egg for every bad actor out on the internet. It's madness. So everyone should be very concerned about that and should be hostile to any attempts to do that. And if we genuinely mean it when we have our Fourth Amendment constitutional rights to being secure in our papers and our, you know, in our things, then that has to mean that data security is included in those things. And in the same way you would never give government the keys to your house, you would never give them the keys to your encrypted private communications.
I'm struck by how closely related this is to the concepts of privacy. Again, I think these observations about how this is a completely new, you know, encroachment by the government into areas that it hasn't had access to in the past is a really apt one. And Adonne, we've talked a little bit about some of the growing momentum at the federal level. There are folks, journalists and others, commenting that this sort of new momentum might be enough to pass legislation at the federal level, either broad legislation or legislation on certain subsections of privacy. What do you think are some benefits and downsides to either broadly or narrowly regulating new areas in privacy?
Sure. One thing I do want to do is to tie in what my other two panelists have also said, is encryption and some of the other protections as it relates to security feed in to privacy. So when we do actually see a lot of privacy legislation, whether it passes, whether it's introduced, they use encryption kind of as a tool in that legislation as an extra measure, right? So they're building in some of these kind of cybersecurity protections into particular laws to not only bolster privacy, but also bolster the security side of things, right? I have a strong feeling and, you know, always lean towards the two should go hand in hand from the moment that it begins, right? It shouldn't be that let's figure out how to protect the privacy and then later on let's figure out how to do the cybersecurity side of things. The two should go hand in hand. And so when we see a lot of these bills, we're seeing that as a part of it. As it relates to the benefits and downsides of regulating subsections of privacy, it's a really tricky question. I don't think there's a right answer or a wrong answer. For instance, we've seen, I think the state of Washington has a really good My Health, My Data Act, which specifically focuses on health data, health information, and personal information as it relates to health. The act itself has passed and is now law in the state, but it really focuses on the health context. Now, your privacy and information and data comes in a lot of other contexts too. So how do we rationalize handling, you know, some of your data gets kind of protected in other instances, it might not get the same protection. It can be really tricky. We're also seeing a point when health data is really, really important. We've seen the overturning of Roe v. Wade, and now we have a strong inclination to wanting to protect that sensitive personal information and protecting that sensitive geolocation and location information for the purpose of just providing protection to individuals where, you know, abortion rights have been taken away. So, you know, in Washington state, the health protection, the protection of health data specifically, really strong. But I do think there's slightly a downside because we start to see these sectoral and very specific subsections, and some states will, you know, try and tackle all of the subsections and all of the aspects of privacy, while others can only maybe move forward one piece of that. So we're leaving individuals kind of in certain places with gaps and with holes in how some of their information is protected. I think one thing that's going to be interesting to watch in this space as we see these different kind of subsections play out in states. I know right now there's a lot of AI specific legislation at the state level in a very like in various numbers in various ways. So some of it's really focused on generative AI, and other ways it's just focused on algorithmic processing and machine learning and decision making, algorithmic decision making. My goodness, and so you kind of see it happen at that level, and maybe it'll get to rise to the level of a federal bill. I'm not quite sure. We are going into election season, so things start to get a little prickly as we start to push forward kind of some of these certain instances. That's not to say, that's not to ignore the states that there are also just no sort of privacy protections and no laws forthcoming to protect individuals' privacy and data, or even provide new cybersecurity requirements in certain states. So what do we do about individuals in states where they haven't even begun to kind of have conversations as it relates to data and privacy? So I think there are benefits to ensuring that certain very sensitive aspects of privacy and data are protected, but there are also real downsides to only offering those certain kinds of protections when it comes to the rest of individuals' data. Or even, it's like I mentioned, it'll be interesting to see how companies that are delving into a number of different things begin to handle the different state level bills and laws that we're going to see. So very interesting. And I hate to give the lawyerly answer of it depends, but it does depend.
Well, I know you're off mute and have some additional comments on zero trust. Do you want to jump in with those as well?
Oh, sure. To address David's question, I apologize for skipping over it initially, but zero trust is a sort of a privacy philosophy or security philosophy that says, we are not going to treat you as having any kind of trust on the network or the ability to access anything or give you any rights merely by virtue of the fact that you have presented some outwardly otherwise seemingly authentic credential, right? So for example, just because you are in the building does not mean that you are an employee, right? Or just because you have been able to use the appropriate password, that doesn't necessarily mean that you are who you say you are. So zero trust is tied, I know you said other than end-to-end encryption. It's not a data protection scheme so much as it's an authentication. It has an authentication focus, right? It says, I need to know that you are, who you say you are, and I'm not going to presume that that's true. And not only am I not going to presume that it's true at the moment when you sort of present yourself to the security infrastructure, but I'm going to continue to doubt that you continue to be who you say you are. So, for example, I'm going to log you out after 30 minutes because I don't know if you walked away from your computer and somebody else is now accessing our network. And also, by the way, if you say that you're Will Pagán, I understand that you are supposed to have entire administrative rights over the entire network, but maybe you're not Will Pagán, and you know what? You don't need to have access to all of that right now. So I'm going to give you as little access as is necessary to accomplish whatever goal you've intended or you've presented as requiring at the moment, right? And so these are mechanisms that sort of take a finer grain approach. One of the big problems in data security is you got somebody who's got the admin password and they're a super user. They log in and now they can do absolutely anything on the network. They can, just take all of the customer's data and download it over to the cloud. And now they've got the keys to the castle. And not only that, but I can delete every user on that network and launch attacks on other networks and create all kinds of havoc merely by having one administrative password. And the problem there is that you have, and by the way, if you're on premises or you're in my office, you don't have to log in at all because I don't have a password on my computer and I walked away from my machine. Social engineering is a component of privacy. And so, calling people up and hey, Debbie, I'm at a client site. Can you just give me give me the client password, the login password. I forgot, I just changed it. And people will do stuff like that. So a zero trust framework says, puts in place mechanisms that force a user to identify themselves to a greater degree, only provide access to the portions of the data security infrastructure that are necessary, and continually evaluate whether or not that access is necessary, and withdraws that access to maintain as little inherent trust, as little implied trust as possible in the users of the network, to ensure that what was a legitimate access does not then get co-opted for an illegitimate purpose.
And I would only add that it's almost standard practice now. At least the larger the firm, the larger the clients you work with, at least in the practice of law, they're going to require it. And you better believe that the malpractice insurance underwriters are going to ensure on a yearly basis that those are in place. And the most common for zero trust is multi-factor. But we've already seen pressure from clients to go above and beyond that. So Will's right in that sense, and and recently they've even been evaluating what are the physical security mechanisms that you have in place in your office, and who can come and who can go, and who has access to what rooms, and so on and so forth. So they're going the extra mile, but it also almost is driven by where that client or that customer, what space they're in, and what regulations they're subjected to. For instance, if they're a defense company, of course, the information they're entrusting us with is probably secret to some extent, or government for sure, and they will want to ensure that even the physical environment's been secured in one way or another, and meeting standards.
Thank you both. Do you want to answer the follow-up question on what is the extra mile in this context that clients are hoping for above best practices?
Yeah, with multi-factor, I mean, I think that's the standard at the moment. I'm not sure. I just seeing that the trend is going that way. There might be mechanisms that are in the pipeline that are not quite standard just yet. But some of the things that Will already touched on are like the timeout procedures. So beyond multi-factor would probably be the bio, and we know we have facial recognition, but it might go get to fingerprint, or it might be a combination of the multi-factor with something that you have like a sort of maybe a digital key that you have to plug in, but they'll want all that in combination. And that definitely just goes towards what Will was noting, which is basically prove to us with multiple credentials, not just your password, that you are who you are. And basically, you should be granted the privileges that you're requesting.
Thanks. And moving on a little bit from the private sector, where it sounds like a lot of these strong security measures are becoming industry standard. As Adonne mentioned, we're headed into a presidential election year here in the United States. So there are a number of privacy and security concerns around that upcoming event. Anup, you focus on keeping data and networks secure. What is sort of keeping you up at night or causing concern as states start to administer these processes?
Yeah, I mean, the infrastructure can only go so far. So I know the concerns are, who can get into the data, and some of the things we touched on already are some of the mechanisms that they're putting in place. But I think we have to always remember there's a human factor, and your weakest point's always going to be the human actor or the human individuals that are involved in the process. Proper training, basically following policy, procedure, and just knowing where the potential hacks, they're very subtle in the ways of how they can get access, and they know that since the mechanisms that the actual digital mechanisms that are in place to secure it are probably strong, or maybe too difficult or too much work to actually to overcome, to kind of get access and do whatever form manipulation they're trying to do. the human factor or the human vector in a sense is always the easiest. And you only have to find maybe one individual in that sense that you can basically dupe into doing something you want them to do, and then basically you probably could get access to it. So it's always the human factor. That's why policies and training are really key to the whole thing. I know people always go to by default just think of, well, it has to do with software tools, it has to do with hardware tools, it has to do with credentials and so on. But I don't think it is. I mean, it comes down to what the humans themselves are doing, what the individual participants are doing. And so they have to be trained up on the latest techniques that bad actors are using these days.
Will, do you have additional either tech or human expertise or training that you would sort of hope to see states implementing as we go into the election season?
Sure. There's a lot of, hubbub, hand-wringing about voter fraud and so on, as if we haven't been stuffing ballot boxes in this country for hundreds of years. This problem of people, submitting votes that, I suspect the amount of fraud is probably at an all-time low, but that's not to say that we can't do a better job. And so if I was to say, what can we do about it in other contexts, particularly in an IT context, the problem of ensuring that people are who they say they are is a solved problem in many regards, right? I mean, I'm not to say that it's that we've invented every possible way to make this bulletproof, but it's a common problem in IT of verifying that someone who is who they say they are in order to be able to perform certain functions or get access to certain data and so on. And we don't have those lessons learned implemented in government, right? So a big one would be multi-factor authentication, which some states are trying to implement, right? By, for example, implementing voter ID laws and things like that. Now, the problem with that, though, is that there is a genuine unbalanced impact to society by just blanketly implementing something like multi-factor authentication by, hey, if you come here and you try to vote, you got to show me your driver's license, you got to show me your passport, you got to show me, a current utility bill or something that matches to an address and that I've got on my records and matches your registration, right? Not everyone is evenly able to obtain access to those credentials, right? I'll give, for example, my grandfather was born in Puerto Rico. All of his records, his birth certificate, and all that is on the island somewhere. I don't know where. If I want to go get a copy of his birth certificate so that I can present it to the Board of Elections, do I have to go down to San Juan and speak Spanish to some local administrator and prove to them I am who I say I am? Like, that is, my grandfather can't do that himself. He's 80, so are we going to deprive him of his right to vote because he's not able to access all of the mechanisms that would be necessary for him to multi-factor authenticate himself? I mean, we're talking about a fundamental right, and, add to that, the man is, for a long time had, he had Alzheimer's, he recently passed, but that doesn't mean that he should be deprived of his rights because, and there are a lot of other people who have similar stories, reasons why they can't get access to a driver's license. They can't get to the polling station. They can't get, one thing or another because they're incarcerated or they're in a hospice or they're whatever, right? So in sum, there are some best practices from IT that we can adopt to better ensure that people are who they say they are. But it's not we're not dealing with computers, we're dealing with genuine people. And, it's easy to ship data around, but it's hard to get grandma down to stand in line at the Register of Deeds for an hour and a half, right? Or wherever it is that she needs to go to do the things that she needs to do. So that is much more of a genuine problem with implementing these measures than the technological one, or just sort of in an abstract sense, implement, how to identify people. We know how to identify people. What we don't know is how to involve the population in their own solution and making sure everyone maintains access in order to participate in a more secure system.
Yeah, thanks for raising those points. I think that disparate access to the various documents is such an important one. And there are also concerns about whether, policies like this would be uniformly enforced across communities, or whether there's an in-group, out-group mentality among poll workers on how strictly things are being enforced. I think really important whenever we're talking about potential proposals for increased security. And Adonne, I think I want to turn to you. Even if this election is, as Will speculated, one of the most sort of fraud-free and secure, with increased use of technology around the process, a concern around elections is misinformation, particularly as increased data collection makes micro-targeting of particularly pernicious misinformation more widespread. I'm wondering what steps you're hoping to see from tech companies, regulators, civil society, maybe a combination of all those groups ahead of the election to mitigate those concerns.
Sure. And one thing that I think we've alluded to in certain regard, but like want to say very much outright, as it relates to the things that Will just said about kind of some of the technology advancements in doing this, there is a large component of discrimination and potential bias that is prolific in the space of algorithms, in the space of facial recognition technology, and kind of technology across the board. That makes all of the things that we've mentioned incredibly more difficult. All of the data and privacy, that I've mentioned, the security steps that Will and Anup have mentioned, there's an extra kind of level of sensitivity here, especially when we talk about marginalized communities, multi-marginalized communities. And that makes all of this a lot more tricky, and can make it more difficult for certain communities. So let's take, for instance, I think at this point, a lot of people have probably had an instance where they've had to, I guess most recently gone to the airport and done like the facial scan to get through security, be it whether you're coming from a different country or even at DCA here in DC, just to get, through security to go to your domestic flight, right? And so some of these technologies impact different individuals differently. Sometimes they don't, pick up Black people, for instance, or can't see your eyes, whatever it is. We add those steps to election and to other kind of government services. We disadvantage a number of people. I think part of it is jumping the gun in terms of getting these technologies out the door before they are fully ready to operate without the bias and discrimination. So I just wanted to put that out there because that I think is something that's really important and crucial to understand about where some of the large concerns and harms exist as it relates to social media platforms and kind of algorithms in the space of disinformation, misinformation. It's not going away. No matter how secure we are at the polls and actually, doing the actual process of voting, we're about to be in March. And I'm so sorry because I cannot do math on the spot, but we're however many months away from November and from the election. And so as time will continue to go, we will continue to see kind of this proliferation of mis and disinformation across the spectrum on all sorts of things, just misinformation, disinformation about candidates, about voting locations, about scandals, about different news incidents, about the Supreme Court. We're going to see a number of different rhetorics kind of play out all across the spectrum of mis and disinformation. Unfortunately, Twitter, because that's what I know it as, has repealed a bunch of their election protection kind of processes that they had in place. When I was at the Lawyers Committee in my previous position, we worked with a lot of companies and organizations leading up to the 2020 election and other midterm elections during my time there to ensure that a lot of online platforms had these specific to election sort of protections as relates to ads and labeling different news stories as this has been verified, this is not, this might be misinformation, allowing individuals to report during the COVID pandemic if something was false or if it wasn't. We've seen some of those peel back. I believe in Instagram most recently decided that they were going to just remove ads as it relates to elections. And so there is a piece of diligence that always lies on the individual. Click the link. read the full story. Do not just take it at face value at the headline. But on the other side of things, I would love to see social media, amp up their election protection, capabilities and labeling. I can't say for sure that is going to happen. So, I encourage everyone to kind of be diligent, reposting misinformation to like set the record straight is still spreading disinformation and misinformation. So don't, repost it and add your 2 cents, just, post your 2 cents, right? So seeing different things like that is kind of where we are. I wish I could say that there's a number one solve to the problem. There is not. I think reporting things that are false or inaccurate can be helpful along the way, but hoping to see these companies kind of step up as they did during 2020 and during was it 2020? Yes, during the 2020 election and also during the COVID pandemic. So I'll stop there.
Thanks. And we've talked a little bit about the potential changes that might be coming in the US in these areas. But there has been sort of a slowness to act, at least at the federal level, despite some of the recent actions. We still don't have, as we talked about earlier, comprehensive federal legislation in either cybersecurity or privacy. There are ways that any of you have seen other actors sort of leading the charge in these areas, whether it's states, which I know Adonne has mentioned, other countries, or since we've talked a little bit about social media, I know in that context, there are sort of collectives of companies that act together in the absence of laws in these areas. For any panelist, are there leaders outside US federal government that you see in this space?
I think from my standpoint, Europe tends to drive a lot. We tend to use them as our framework and our guide, especially, let's say, for the data privacy. But even the European individual countries, they have their own requirements and how they protect their public. And just to kind of give you an example, like I said, I deal with patents. And though this doesn't relate to data privacy directly, it kind of indicates just how much interest the government has in protecting individuals' rights. So, when it comes to patent rights and invention rights in say a country like Germany, they're very strict about how that process plays out and what agreements are in place, and so much more than the U.S. And then, given that public interest focus and standpoint rather than a business focus, they tend to have the framework and the guidelines that we tend to come out first, kind of set the standard for everyone else to kind of at least take a look at. And so I feel like the U.S. isn't necessarily blind in the direction they need to go in. They definitely have partners that they can kind of look and follow and see where they're going and actually how it plays out as well, the good and the bad when it comes to these things, and how to balance it out. But I think Europe for sure is where we typically look for sort of guidance in this space.
And I'd just add to that, in the United States, California is going to be the leading state for, they are adopting very Euro analogous approaches to security and data, and are comfortable being the center of attention and the pain in the butt for the rest of the country and making things more onerous for business, in a way that has national implications, even though it's implemented at state level. And so we've seen that in other spaces, by the way, where, California is first to step out and be a problem for the industry. And now we've got to, everybody in the country has to adhere. California has the highest standard, so everything that we do has to meet California standard, and it sort of drags the rest of the country with it. We've seen that for emissions policy. We've seen that for, sort of green policies, and now we're seeing it in data security. So.
And as we're thinking about sort of lessons the US could take from California or Europe or both, are there ways that US policymakers can be sure to implement a lens of equity and inclusion in their policies. I think Adonne rightly pointed out some of the disparities that are currently maybe not being significantly addressed at a technological level, and may come into place as more tech is implemented.
One thing I'll add is, I mean, I think that there is a lot of the solutions that we are increasingly seeing are derived from technology, and not everybody has the same access to technology. So, this is not just a racial issue, but it's also, a sort of inner city rural issue. It's a social class issue. There are equity issues wrapped around that. And anytime you implement a technological solution, there's also sort of educational elitism issues there too, right? I mean, the challenge with implementing technological solutions is making sure everybody has access to it. And that's something that's where the legislators, the computer scientists have done their part. Now it's time for the legislators to figure out how to enable the populace to ensure equity amongst equity of access, equity of implementation, and so on.
I know we're in our last minutes. I'll just echo that. And happy to always have more conversations in this space about harms. That's a whole separate panel as it relates to technology and bias and discrimination and the impacts on those in different communities. I mean, we talk about race as that oftentimes, but let's take it even broader, thinking about those in rural communities versus those of us in large populous communities, right? The disparities can be large. We can think about the age gap. And so there's a lot of things to think about. I think one of the best ways to ensure that equity and inclusion are always thought of, being that I started at the Lawyers Committee, I was kind of trained on thinking about civil rights in the context of technology. So while we love innovation and with our IP backgrounds, that is what drives the world of intellectual property is innovation and newness. But understanding that while we can innovate, while we can create new, why don't we think about what could happen at the other end? Let's not just be excited about this new shiny thing that does X, Y, or Z. Let's always be considering who might not be able to have access to this. How might this harm someone who looks differently than the people in the room that created the new shiny piece of technology, right? So some of it is building in and building in testing, building in auditing, again, a whole nother conversation, but into these technologies, into these different processes. I know inside in the security and cybersecurity space, there's often groups red teaming to try and break the systems and understand that, just because we're creating this new security mechanism, it might not be perfect the first time. So let's figure out where it goes wrong so that we can best protect, whatever it's trying to do. So I think there's a number of things that can happen from the moment of inception all the way through execution and deployment of the technology. In the chat, I shared some of my favorite books by Black authors on our bonus day of Black History Month. I'm also going to share another one. Shout out to Professor Jamar for my favorite book on algorithmic understanding kind of the world of AI.
Thanks, Adonne. And I want to encourage the audience. I think we have a few more minutes. If anyone has questions, drop them into the chat. And I also want to turn to Will and Anup. Are there recommended readings, listenings, news things to follow if folks are getting more interested in these topics as we're having these discussions?
Yeah, I think it's always a little hard to keep track of it given how much is coming out. I think keeping track of where the government stands, at least. I know, I think it was a Department of Commerce had put out some guidance on security, and it was more to do with quantum computing, but like that sort of is the direction our industry has to go in, because lo and behold, we're going to have quantum computers at some point, and those are going to be an issue from an encryption standpoint. So aside from the Gen AI tools and the issues we're dealing with, that's the quantum computing and the encryption issue is on the horizon as well. And I believe the government's readying itself for that that day, that future. So from that standpoint, some of our government agencies are already coming out with guidances on best practices, what we should be already looking into to better secure our data, basically.
And for my part, I would generally encourage everyone to develop or increase their computer literacy. And because to an increasing degree, legislation is going to start being implemented in a way that those who are tech savvy are not going to be able to detect the exploitation. Right? We're going to be implementing policies that sound good on paper because freedom or America or, being tough on crime or whatever, but they're not going to understand the second order and third order effects of these policies unless they understand, what it is that they're asking for. Right? And we've very recently seen, for example, some zany decisions being made with respect to medical health and things of that nature, because we've got legislators who don't understand the science. And so when it comes to data privacy, the science is largely in the computing domain. I would encourage folks to, even if your local jurisdiction does not have a focus on computer education, supplement it with something for your kids, because it's going to become essential for them to be able to detect computing level BS out there in the world being implemented to their detriment.
I think that's such an important point. I think we're already seeing that as well. I know some of my research at the Brennan Center for Justice revolves around police departments onboarding surveillance technology without understanding what they're using at all, or what the capabilities are, or how long and for what purpose they can hold on to data. So these tech underlying questions are becoming more and more prevalent. I think we have one question in the chat. What is the best way for more tech-savvy people in the legal world to make their voices heard, specifically in consideration to legislation?
We need more computer scientists, PhDs, STEM people with STEM backgrounds in government and in the legislature, in decision-making positions, elected to higher office. There's a lot of pushback in a lot of places around the country where, people don't want these academic elites at the highest institutions because, they don't speak to the common people or what have you. But excuse me, but if I've got something that's going to affect the lives of millions of people, I want someone that's elite, so, unfortunately, science and STEM disciplines are entirely underrepresented in government, but we're increasingly asking them to do STEM literate things. So, I think the best way for more tech savvy people in the legal world to make their voices heard is to run for office or, support those who run for office. The level of education among those who are House representatives in small districts is abysmal. And these are the people that are deciding the future of your healthcare rights, your data privacy rights, whether you have access to elections, whether you can exercise your freedoms, and whether your children will be able to enjoy this planet. So I would say, we don't have that representation now amongst our lawmakers, and we need to improve that, increase that.
And I know we're at time, so I do apologize, but I must provide an alternative to running for office for those who are not inclined to political positions, because I resonate with that quite a bit. So on the other side, I do echo that we do need more individuals in this space to actually go and run for office and be on that political side. If that is not what you are inclined to do, on the alternative, there are a number of government agencies, contractors, entities that work in and around the government that are convening roundtables, conversations, discussions. I know today, I believe there's a conversation, Axios is holding a conversation with NIST leaders who are probably going to be talking a bit about upcoming AI and other standards that they've been working on. And so tuning in to those different events, asking questions, bring your technical expertise to those rooms where it might feel more policy oriented or more focused on, surface level discussions about technology or about AI or how something works. Bring your expertise to those conversations. Look for opportunities where you can join and provide it, because I guarantee you'll be the ones that land a follow-up question from the presenters or from the organizations because they don't understand it. And so positioning yourself and staying abreast of kind kind of the different publications that do a number of different convenings, hosting roundtables. Brookings Institute is great for hosting a bunch of different conversations and in the full range and spectrum of issues in the tech and policy and AI and biometric space. As I mentioned, NIST, I think, is having a conversation. NTIA has currently started having conversations. Look for those different opportunities, and I'll stick around and drop some publications that might be useful in the chat for individuals to kind of see where those things pop up. But that, I think, is one of the better ways that you might get into this space without actually having to potentially run for office.
Thanks so much, Adonne and Will, for those recommendations. They're great ones. And thanks to all of our panelists for their expertise and time today. This was a great conversation.